Welcome, everyone, to another episode of Bright Headed Publishing Audiobook Book Club. I am your host, Kelly Morgan. Today, I'm excited to bring you Chapter 7 of my novel, You Sound White. You Sound White is available on Amazon, Barnes & Noble, and other online ebook retailers. You can also check out my second book, Wait For It. Wait For It is the story of one woman's journey to be thin. Wait For It is available on Amazon, Barnes & Noble, and other online ebook retailers. But enough of that. Let's get right to it. Chapter 7, You Sound White. Main voices by Mershelle Reeves. Secondary voices and narration by yours truly, Kelly Morgan. Zoe stood in the kitchen of her restaurant. She watched as the delivery driver wheeled in the week's food order, then carefully set the pallet down and left the kitchen to return to his truck. She inspected the pallet and waited for him to return. He was grunting as he pushed the heavy dolly over the doorway threshold.
"Excuse me,"
she said as he rolled the dolly into the kitchen.
"I don't think this pallet belongs to me. The label says the eatery."
The delivery driver stared at her, then walked over to the pallet and bent down. So, you're right. Well, I already delivered to them. You're the last stop of the day. He stood back up, making a grunting noise on the way up. I'm going home after this. Why don't you just keep it? Consider it a present. He winked at her and started for the door.
"Wait a minute.
Zoe said.
I can't just keep their stuff. Can't you just put it back on the truck and take it to them tomorrow?"
The driver sighed. Look, lady, if I come in the morning with orders on my truck, I could get fired. I know you people know how to shuck and jive. So just give it to your homeboys to sell. Whatever.
"Excuse me? Shuck and jive? You people? What the hell do you mean by that?"
Zoe said angrily. The delivery driver frowned. Look, I don't care what you do with it. Sell it, keep it. As far as I'm concerned, I delivered it. Now, you want to get rid of it? Well, do what you people do best. You know exactly what I'm talking about. He turned and rolled the dolly out of the kitchen, then out of the back door of the restaurant. Zoe watched in amazement as the driver left. She looked at the door, then back at the pallet. She walked over to the pallet, bent down, and pulled back some of the packaging and read out loud.
"Fruit cups? What the hell am I going to do with 200 fruit cups?"
Her phone rang.
"Hello? What's up, girl?"
Chloe said.
"I just got 200 fruit cups." "Fruit cups? It's a long story. What's up?" "So, I wanted to find out more about the shelter. I have a client who's looking to maybe donate or partner. Can you give me the director's name and number?"
Zoe walked into her office.
"Sure. Who's the client?" "Yes, I'm being nosy."
She said.
"That sexy, tall drink of Hennessy, Stanley Roberts."
Chloe said. Zoe laughed.
"Why you gotta be Hennessy?"
Chloe laughed.
"Because Hennessy is smooth and warm going down."
She answered in a matter-of-fact tone.
"Well,"
Zoe said.
"that explains everything."
Zoe provided Chloe with the information and clicked off her cell phone. She decided to call the eatery and let them know she had their order. She looked at the number and dialed. The eatery, a voice answered.
"Hi, I believe I received an order for you that was delivered to me."
Zoe said. Please hold, the voice said. After several moments, a voice came on the phone. Can I help you? The voice asked. Zoe explained the situation about the mix-up in orders and waited for a reply. Well, I show that order as being delivered.
"Well,"
Zoe said.
"I have 200 fruit cups in my kitchen that say the eatery."
A brief moment of silence followed. Well, the voice said. I show we've received everything, so you can send them back or keep them, lady. Zoe shook her head.
Okay, I guess.
She said, then clicked off the phone.
What am I going to do with 200 fruit cups?
She said out loud. Lily rubbed her hands together. The weather was getting chilly. She sat on the front step of the shelter. Her face was worn and chapped. She blew air into her hands to warm them, but it didn't seem to help. She rocked back and forth and started to sing. Her voice rose into the air, and she watched as her breath left her body with the sounds that came deep from within her. As she closed her eyes and continued singing, passerbys would stop and listen. Some would leave money, others would comment, "Your voice is beautiful." But Lily paid no attention. She sat rocking back and forth with her eyes closed, singing. Tallulah was walking toward the shelter when she heard that voice. She hurried her pace and found Lily singing on the steps of the shelter. She saw a few dollar bills and coins sitting in front of her. As she watched Lily sing, she noticed she seemed to look different, at peace, maybe even happy. She looked peaceful and alive at the same time. Tallulah watched the small crowd that had gathered in front of Lily. They listened as she sang, and Tallulah heard them make comments like beautiful or what a voice. When Lily was done, she opened her eyes, surprised to see a small crowd that had gathered around her. She looked around and said,
I wrote that.
The crowd clapped and began to disperse. Tallulah waited until the crowd was gone, then walked up to Lily.
Hi, Lily. That was a beautiful song.
She said, sitting down next to her. As soon as she sat down, she could smell the foul odor coming from Lily. She shook her head and tried to overcome the stench, but it overtook the small area in which they sat.
Is that your money?
Lily said, looking at the dollars and coins sitting at her feet. Tallulah shook her head.
No, that's for you. The people left it while you were singing.
She said. Lily reached down, picked up the dollar bills and coins, and put them in her coat pocket. She turned and looked at Tallulah.
What do you want? You go get your own money.
She said.
I don't want your money, Lily. I like to listen to you sing.
She said. Lily smiled at Tallulah.
When I was a young girl, I would sing for my grandma. She loved to hear me sing. She made me join the choir and church. I was going to be famous, and I was going to take me and Clyde.
Tallulah raised an eyebrow.
Who's Clyde?
She asked. Lily looked at her and frowned.
Clyde is my twin brother. He couldn't sing, but he could write. He wrote stories and was going to be famous too.
Tallulah shook her head and shivered a little.
Lily, let's go inside and get something warm to drink.
She stood up and reached out for Lily's hand. Lily looked at her hand and stood up without grabbing it.
I don't know you. You want my money.
She said.
No, I don't want your money, Lily. I just want you to come inside. It's cold.
She stared at Tallulah for a moment and said,
Okay, but this is my money. Ain't enough for two of us.
Once inside, Lily walked over to a table in the large dining room. She sat down and took the money out of her pocket and began to count each coin. Tallulah watched her for a moment as Lily picked up each coin, held them in her hand, and smiled. She then took the coins and held them up to the light. She was talking to the coin, but Tallulah couldn't make out what she was saying. She was so caught up in watching Lily, she didn't even notice Anna standing next to her.
Hi, Tallulah.
Anna said. Words broke Tallulah's trance-like state.
Oh, you startled me.
Tallulah said.
I didn't even notice you standing next to me.
Anna smiled.
Come to my office.
She said and motioned for Tallulah to follow her. Tallulah watched Lily for a few more moments, then followed Anna to her office.
Sit down.
Anna said. Tallulah sat in a chair in front of Anna's desk.
So,
Anna said.
you really seem fascinated by Lily.
Tallulah was a little embarrassed.
I am. Her voice, it's so beautiful. She was singing when I walked up. She had a small crowd gathered around her. She even made a little money.
Anna nodded her head.
Yes, Lily showed up years ago, or at least since I've been here. She is a songbird.
Tallulah pulled out her notebook and tape recorder.
Do you mind if I tape our conversation?
Anna looked at the recorder.
No, nothing here is a secret.
She replied.
Great.
Said Tallulah.
Okay, feel free to ask me whatever you'd like.
Anna said. She spent the morning interviewing Anna about the shelter. She took notes along with recording.
So, tell me about Lily.
She said.
I was thinking about highlighting some of the people who depend on the shelter. Lily seems to be a regular. Well,
Anna said.
like I said, Lily has been coming around for years. She just showed up one day. I talked to her about getting off the street. Some days she's open to the idea and will even start to fill out the paperwork. Then other days she's incoherent. She mutters to herself. She insists on being on the street. She says it's her punishment.
Tallulah cocked her head to one side.
Punishment for what?
She asked.
I have no idea.
Anna said.
Did you know she had a twin brother?
Tallulah asked.
Clyde.
Said Anna.
Yeah, she talks about him. I think he was killed in an automobile accident, but I've never been able to confirm. She also mentioned someone named Amanda. Does that ring a bell for you?
Tallulah asked. Anna sat for a moment.
Now that you say it, yes. She's mentioned Amanda before. I'm not sure who she is. She told me Amanda took everything from her. I'm not sure what that means.
Tallulah nodded her head.
She told me the same thing.
Anna opened her bottom desk drawer and pulled out a file.
I started the application for housing a few years ago, but I was never able to get her to finish filling it out. This is all I have.
She handed the file to Tallulah, who opened it and began to read.
All the contact information is blank.
Anna nodded.
I know. I've also tried to get her to give me the information so that I can get her birth certificate and ID. When I mention it, she goes crazy. She says they'll find her. Who will find her?
Tallulah asked.
I don't know. Maybe Amanda? All I know is that Lily likes living off the grid. I think something happened, something traumatic that made her walk away from her life.
Tallulah sat for a moment.
Okay, so let's talk about funding.
She said, putting down Lily's file.
Well,
Said Anna.
there isn't much to tell. We had a large donor who pledged a lot of money. We were going to build a new shelter. It would have been much bigger than this. I thought we would be able to offer services besides food and shelter. What kind of services?
Tallulah asked.
Counseling, mental health, employment services, job training, or school. Something to help these people reclaim their lives. I also wanted to have a school for children. Just because you're homeless doesn't mean you should stop learning.
Tallulah looked at Anna.
So, what happened to the funding? I'm not sure.
Anna answered.
One day we had it, the next day our money bags donor backed out. No explanation. I just had to put all of the services I wanted to provide on hold. We can barely offer the 3 daily meals and shelter at night. Money is tight.
Tallulah shifted in her seat.
Did you ever find out who the donor was?
Anna shook her head.
Anonymous.
she said.
So what happens now?
Asked Tallulah.
We depend on volunteers. Like your friend Zoe, we depend on donations. How many volunteers do you have?
Tallulah asked.
They come and go. I have my regulars who come in several times a week.
She paused.
Wait, I think Mark is here. I should have you talk to him. He volunteers quite often. He's trying to start his own business, but he manages to come and help out. He's really bonded with Lily, too.
Tallulah looked up.
Okay, he's here?
Anna stood up.
I think he's in the kitchen. Let's see if we can find him.
Anna and Tallulah left the office and started for the kitchen. Tallulah could hear singing. It was faint, but as they got closer, she could hear two voices. Anna looked at Tallulah.
Yes, he's in the kitchen with Lily.
They walked into the kitchen to find Mark and Lily singing. Lily was smiling, holding a spoon like a microphone. Mark was drumming on the counter. They didn't notice Anna and Tallulah standing in the doorway.
Lovers come and then lovers go. That's what folks say. Don't they know they're not there when you love me? Hold me and say you care. What we have is much more than they can see. What we have is much more than they can see.
Mark noticed Anna and Tallulah standing in the door. He stopped the soft drumming and looked at Lily, who was holding her spoon microphone, as well as the last note. She noticed Mark was no longer drumming and stopped singing. Sorry, Anna. Too loud? Mark said. Anna shook her head and walked over to him.
No, not at all. That was a beautiful song. I've heard it before.
She said. Tallulah and Mark said in unison,
LTD,
LTD, Love
love
Ballad.
ballad.
Mark looked at Tallulah and smiled. That's correct. A music lover, he said. Tallulah smiled. Lily put down her spoon microphone and looked at Mark, then looked at Tallulah.
I know lots of songs.
Lily said.
I used to be a great singer. All gone now. Amanda took everything.
She started to scream.
She took it all. She took Clyde. She took Owen, everything. That lying bitch. Bitch.
Mark grabbed Lily and wrapped his arms around her. It's okay, Lily. He rocked her back and forth. It's okay. Lily buried her face into Mark's chest. She was sobbing. Anna and Tallulah watched as Mark calmed Lily down. He hummed to her and rocked her back and forth. Finally, after several minutes, he released her. Lily, he said, I've got you. It's okay. No one will hurt you here. He wiped her tears from her dirty face. She smiled.
I used to be so beautiful and young.
He smiled at her. You are beautiful and young. Anna walked over to Lily.
Lily, how about you help me in the dining room? We need to set up for lunch.
Lily nodded her head and took Anna's hand.
Mark, this is Tallulah Brock. She's doing a news story on the shelter. I thought you'd be a great person for her to speak with.
She took Lily and led her out of the kitchen. Tallulah watched them leave, then turned back toward Mark. He was smiling at her. She couldn't help noticing how incredibly good looking he was. He was tall, chocolate brown, and green eyes. His smile was white and wide. As she found herself staring at this gorgeous man, his facial features perfectly chiseled, she felt a quiver run through her body. Hi, he said in a deep, soothing voice. I'm Mark. He held out his hand. She reached for it and managed to say,
I'm T. I mean Tallulah.
Mark smiled, and Tallulah thought she felt herself melt a little. Nice to meet you. You doing a story? He asked.
Yeah, on the shelter. I wanted to highlight some of the people who depend on the shelter. Tell their story.
She said. She was trying not to stare, but found herself captivated by his smile. Well, Mark said, I've been a volunteer for about 3 years. I really like it. I found out by accident that Lily is a songbird. One day I was in the kitchen, singing with my headphones on. She wandered over to me and just started singing. We sing a lot. She's a great singer, as you heard. He walked over to the sink and began to rinse dishes. I help out whenever I can. I like it, the giving back. He continued to rinse the dishes. She walked over to him. She stood next to the sink and watched as he rinsed.
Do you think I could interview you for my story?
Tallulah asked. He continued to rinse. Sure, I'm almost done, he smiled. She felt the melting sensation run through her body again.
Okay. Well, I'll wait for you in the dining room.
She said. Okay, he answered. She watched him rinse the dishes.
A man who does dishes and is fine.
She thought to herself, then turned and left the kitchen. Mark entered the dining room. Tallulah was waiting for him at a table. Her notebook and recorder sat in front of her. He walked over to her. Wow, a real interview, huh? She smiled.
I hope you don't mind being recorded.
She said. No, I'm good, he answered as he sat across from her. So, what do you want to know? He said. She turned on the voice recorder and looked up at Mark.
So, Mark, what do you do here?
She asked. He smiled. Well, a little bit of everything. I mostly help out in the kitchen, clean, do laundry, and help the people who come here. She nodded her head.
What about Lily? You seem to really have a connection with her.
He leaned forward, interlocked his fingers, and placed them on the table. I do. She reminds me of an auntie. She has troubles, but when it comes to singing, well, you heard her. I always look out for Lily. She just showed up one day. She was alone and lost. I try to keep her from drinking, but it really hasn't worked. She pretty much drinks every day. He stopped. She drinks to forget, he added.
Forget what?
Tallulah asked. Her life, he said. A moment of silence passed between them, then Mark finally spoke. From what I know, she's had it pretty hard. Tallulah nodded.
I want to highlight her in my story. I was hoping to learn more about her. Her voice is sensational. She has one of those voices that's unforgettable. It resonates with you. I'm surprised she doesn't make a living singing.
Mark looked at her. It's funny you say that. I said the same thing. I know she had a brother, but he died years ago. Tallulah looked excited.
Yes, she told me she has a twin.
She said. Mark nodded his head. She said that to me as well. I tried to find out more, but she doesn't talk about it. I get bits and pieces, he said. I just listen to her. I try to get her off the street, but she won't. He looked at his watch. Well, it's almost time to prep for lunch. Are you staying to help out? He asked. She looked at him.
I'd stay if you asked me to.
She thought to herself.
I can, if you need the help.
She said. He smiled at her. We can always use the help, he said.
Wait, so what do you do when you aren't here?
She asked. Well, he said. "Follow me to the kitchen. I'll give you my life story." Thank you so much for listening to another episode of Bright Headed Publishing Audiobook Book Club. I have been your host, Kelly Morgan. You have just listened to Chapter 7 of my novel, You Sound White. You Sound White is available on Amazon, Barnes & Noble, and other online ebook retailers. Don't forget to check out my second book, Wait For It, which is the story of one woman's journey to be thin. Wait For It is also available on Barnes & Noble, Amazon, and other online ebook retailers. Thank you again for listening. Can't wait for next week for another episode. Until then, keep writing.